Welcome to my show, When Everyone Wins, where a key goal I have for you is shifting from power over and under to power within and between. I'm your host, Judy Ryan. In each episode, I'll share my knowledge from decades in workplace culture transformation and leadership development as the founder and CEO of LifeWork Systems. I'll help you build trust and emotional and social intelligence. My show, When Everyone Wins, is about creating a life you love and helping others do the same.
I can't wait to introduce you. I'm Dr. Pat, and I get to do these first shows. It's very rare that I think about my life and I think about, now, how did I get to talk to somebody like a Judy Ryan? You know, how did that even happen? And when you start to really look at that, what you realize is you really didn't do it. Your life is orchestrated in such an amazing way. The good, the bad, the ugly, the short, the long, all of it comes together. Judy is the host of Everyone Wins. But what you should know about her, she has an uncanny attraction to beauty, to looking at what's beneath a person, to uncovering that. And that transfers over to her work as a consultant. During this show and throughout this series, this is one of many, many conversations you're going to get from Judy, CEO of LifeWork Systems. You're going to hear about that. But don't you all want to know what I want to know about Judy? Don't you want to know about the title of this show? I'm telling you, When Everyone Wins. Now, let's just be very clear. Just want to be clear. I love you, Russell Wilson. Just want to be very, very clear. When you're playing a sport, there's a winner on a team and a loser on a team. But what an individual does with that experience is purely independent. Today, I want you to meet somebody that ticks to the clock of empowerment, human potential, and helping people understand what they can't even see for themselves. Judy, it's so great to be introducing you here today. I am so excited about this. It has been so cool to go on this journey with you from the first time we met to the creation of your show brands and banners. And here we are today live. Wow. I mean, you want to pinch yourself for a minute, but don't hurt yourself.
Yes, I feel the same way. I'm really excited.
Well, let's talk about this. The show name is When Everyone Wins. And I think that is an important question or conversation. But there's something more important to what you're doing with the show, and it's shifting power over and power under to power within and power between. So you have a lot to talk about just explaining those two thoughts.
Well, I'm so grateful that you're asking me to kind of go into some explanation. I also want to comment on what you said about in sports, there's a winner and a loser. That's really true. But I also know that even in the NBA, for example, they have set it up so all the different teams, the ones that are the big winners and the ones that aren't well known yet, all have an equal playing field and are all honored to be in that space. So even when there's a winner and a loser, it's if we approach with allowing everyone to have equal chances to be masterful at something. And the reason I named the show this is for a long, long time, I've realized that where culture needs to shift is one in which we use power differently. So I actually, as you remember, I had the tagline before I had the show name. But what I realize is that the shift in our world, the shift in our organizations is from win-lose to win-win. It does not mean that some people don't get ahead. It doesn't mean that some people are in various roles that look like they're hierarchical, or maybe they are because of the requirements of a job. But in terms of how we treat one another, treating one another in a win-win fashion and creating certain kinds of conditions allow people to kind of expand into the best version of themselves. And when we don't have an environment that cares about creating that win-win, what I see happen is people become very discouraged. They often misbehave. They often go through disengagement, stress, struggle, all kinds of negative things. So the reason I ended up naming the show, you and I had gone over all of these names. They were floating around in my head. As is kind of my practice, I'll sometimes just let go and ask that the answer come to me. And I happened to hear an interview by Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut. And he started out by talking about an article that he had written where men are in crisis right now. Many men. Men commit suicide at a much higher rate than women. Women are sort of passing men up in terms of a lot of the education. And there's a perception that's kind of being sold to men that they have to win over various people, whether it's gender or race, in order to be successful themselves. And he said, that's just not true. Men really don't want to win at the cost of other people. But in that feeling of I'm losing, they haven't really been in the kind of conditions where they feel that they can win. And women aren't really, he also talks about women aren't really winning right now either fully. We're not being paid equally and things like that. But if we all believed in systems where everyone can win, it's a totally different ballgame then.
Yeah.
And so that's where I thought, oh, that's what I want to call the show, When Everyone Wins. I could have called it Everyone Wins, but right now we're not there yet. So it's the vision for that
Yeah.
we create those conditions.
This is so interesting. Judy, along the way, for those of you just tuning in, this is a debut show of When Everyone Wins. This is Judy Ryan, who is the host of that show. This is also about shifting power over and under to power within and between. And what that means, we're going to dig into a little bit more. But this is sort of an extension of LifeWork Systems as well. I mean, this is not just a new philosophy to do a show. I just want to be clear about that, Judy. This is a value system that you have had and that gets incorporated in everything you do, whether it's your company, whether it's a consult, whether it's the clinic, it doesn't matter what it is. This is a philosophy that we're bringing to the forefront so that we can hold the space for this to emerge. What is it about that conversation, that article about men, where does shifting power over, power under, where does that come in? They would have to adapt to that, of course, right?
Right. I guess really the larger conversation is around how we use power. And there was a book written by Katty Kay and Claire Shipman called The Power Code. And it's really about why more women aren't in the highest levels of position within organizations in general. And it's because women in general, not this, these are all generalities, tend to really like power between and power with and power for very collaboratively, and don't really like the zero-sum game, win-lose dynamics. And so in their book, they talk about if we don't change the way that we use power within organizations, Gabor Mate, who wrote The Myth of Normal, he says the same thing. If we don't start changing the dynamics for how individuals use power, we will always have these conditions where people feel discouraged and then they're oppositional or just shutting down. So you're right that this has been a longstanding approach for my company of 23 years, but even earlier than that, because I originally was introduced to this model by a psychiatrist, Alfred Adler. And he was around a long, long time, but he hasn't really gotten the press, because I believe that if people really understood that psychology, they would no longer want to do win-lose. They would no longer see that as a worthwhile thing to do. And so our society has probably not been ready. But over the past couple of decades, organizational development and culture is starting to evolve into this same kind of model that we've been promoting for decades now.
Yeah.
And it's one that doesn't focus on top down. Sorry.
Well, it has to, though, Judy. Don't you remember? I think you and I talked not too long ago, and I shared with you, since there's been a couple of shows that have talked about this, I shared with you that the fact that in the workforce now, or in the recruiting arena, I don't even want to call it recruiting anymore, because we've had a decade of a generation that has come through, and the things that were important to previous generations were not important to them. I mean, clearly, yes, getting paid, clearly, those kind of fundamental Maslow at the bottom deal, right? But there was something else they brought to the table. In almost every study that I got my hands on, there were two factors that were introduced at three at an extraordinarily high score. One is I want to be treated with respect. Two is I need to work in a company that understands compassion. And three was empathy has got to be at the top of my food chain. So don't those values support what you're saying? And yet we got a big gap between what we say we want, we got a gap here. I mean, we're talking about don't know power over, power under. Can you just clarify about that? Because people, when they hear power over, under, they think of oligarchies or something. But no, two people can have a verbal relationship, just verbal, by the way, a verbal relationship, and that verbal relationship is threatening, is fearful, it's manipulative, right? So that's how shifting power over and power under to power within and power between, that's how that comes in. Now the question is, where do we begin, and where have you begun in LifeWork Systems?
Well, I want to first say that power doesn't even always look like domination and coercion.
Thank
Sometimes
you.
power over can look like neglect. And I'll just tell you a personal reason why I do this work. One of the things that Adlerian psychology teaches is that we all want to feel a healthy sense of belonging and significance. And when we feel a healthy belonging and significance, we feel those things that you mentioned: respect, compassion, empathy. We have those given to us, and we're offering those. He also said we feel four primary feelings. We feel empowered. We have a voice. We feel that we are lovable, which is different than loved. Lovable is when we feel seen and heard. When people want to listen to us with receptivity and understand how our mind works and what we think and how did we come to our conclusions and what can we contribute. And also people want to feel healthy connection. But a lot of us have had such unhealthy connection that we come to the table with a lot of trauma, even if it's small t trauma. And then the other thing he said that's part of healthy belonging and significance is being able to make contributions. And most of us aren't given adequate ability to do that. In fact, when somebody is underperforming, what typically is done to them is dangling carrots, not asking more of them, which would give them greater fulfillment.
Oh.
So just to kind of finish that out, when I was being raised in my family, I was raised in a very conventional, well, in some ways a conventional family, very loving. But my parents, God love them in that era, and it's still this that is trying to be changed in our society. They didn't really know how to ask and listen and really see that I might have a different perspective. If I did offer one, they lovingly told me how I was wrong and they were right. And that kind of thing is also power over and power under, but it's more subtle. And people end up feeling those, experiencing that within the workplace, but they don't even know how to put into words why it sort of cumulatively wears them down.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
and I want to take a short break because when we come back, I want to talk with you about how you are, how the company, your company, LifeWork Systems, how you've included that mission, those values, that vision into what we're talking about today. And especially in the spirit of what I said before, there's this gap, albeit we're not talking about it, but there's this gap that contributes to organizations breaking down. There's something going on, and I'm really struck by this, especially given that I live in the greater Seattle area and I'm right down the street, so to speak, from Boeing. I mean, Boeing has multiple locations here. Boeing is the company that builds the planes we fly in. And, you wonder, what does it take for what does a company like that have to operate like so that they build something that is safe for the rest of us? And when we take a look at some of these things, what do you think Judy's going to share with us? The missing value. What do you think she's going to pop out as a missing value? And do you think threats from your management actually work? Let's take a short break. When we come back, more from Judy Ryan. I'll let you know all about her company, but you're going to hear from her yourself. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dr. Pat. You know me as the host of the Dr. Pat Show, also the founder of the Transformation Network. But today I have the honor of introducing all of you to Judy Ryan within her own show. This is a show you'll be hearing just want to say, this is a regular series. This is not a one-time show with Judy. That's the most important thing to remember. When everyone wins, shifting power over and under to power within, in between. We're going to talk about what that means in the context of real situations. We're going to talk about LifeWork Systems. But before we do that, Judy, how do we find out more about you? How do we find out about your services, all of that?
Well, I would love it if people would look into our website. We have a ton of content and information on there. It's lifeworksystems.com. And you can find us on LinkedIn. You can find us on business pages on Facebook and also on Twitter or X.
Yeah. Listen, I want to kind of talk about your company for a minute because, you know, there's a lot. Somebody said to me, there's a lot when you look at a company, there's a lot you could tell from the people who are in it. And that sounds easier than it is. But LifeWork Systems, I mean, just that name it tells us something. Can you talk about your company, its formation, and how this idea of when everyone wins has been part of your energetic vibration in building the company?
Thank you. First of all, our parent company name is also indicative of what we're all about, which is expanding human potential. We started doing business as LifeWork Systems because we really want people to understand that to really change our organizations or homes or any individual, we have to do it on a systemic level. It's really changing some foundational components to how we see the world and how we interact with things and to undo some of the conditioning we have. So that's part of the reason we put systems into the company name, is that if we all have healthy human systems, we can be healthy human beings. And you had asked me before the break, you know, what causes a company like a Boeing or any organization to be one that is high performing and effective and successful. And I would say that the most important thing that any organization can do is to begin to define what sort of an organization are they. And in our world, that is something called a responsibility-based culture. It's a culture where everyone is trained in their own personal development. I told you kind of the first time we met that even when my 5 children were growing up, by the time they were 5, they knew how to run a family meeting. And we taught them all these skills of leadership from the time they were little so they would feel empowered, lovable, connected, and contributing. Now that sounds trite when you think about a large organization like a Boeing, but it's really predicated on the same kind of a model where people share power, where they operate from purpose and core values, and everything aligns with those purposes and core values. If you have freedom without responsibility, you have tyranny. I mean, you have anarchy. If you have responsibility without freedom, you have tyranny. And like you said during the break, no fun is happening. People feel coerced.
That's right.
So when you have a responsibility-based model, it's really about developing the agility of people to lead and follow, to be able to collaborate without being afraid of one another, which requires a high level of trust amongst people. It requires people to be critical thinkers. So in a model that is about emotional and social intelligence, people have a high level of awareness about themselves and about their dynamics with others, but they also have a high level of being able to manage themselves and their relationships with others. And most importantly, people need to be able to come to workplaces that they can be themselves without having to put on some kind of a fake game face. So a holistic environment where people are safe, psychologically safe to show up and without fear of, loss. So what I see happening that in our work in culture change, we have a 14-month process. And we moved one of the hardest sessions to the very beginning finally, because we started to realize it used to be in the 4th month, then we put it at the end, and then we finally put it at the beginning. But it was really about everybody defining their purpose in a way that is truly useful. A lot of companies think they have a good purpose, but it isn't necessarily one that causes them to focus on what they're creating for their employees, for their customers, for their vendors, for the world.
Yeah.
I'll give you a quick example. We worked with a company that was a stray rescue company, and their purpose statement was, "We are a safe haven for dogs." Well, that was great for the dogs, but they were at each other like dogs as employees. They weren't necessarily getting along with the neighborhood where the dogs were being walked. They weren't necessarily making sure they were a safe haven for the people who were adopting the dogs. I'm just using that as an example. So our purpose for our company is to create a world in which all people love their lives. And I remember in the early days of the company, marketing people saying to me, "Oh, these companies that you approach, they're not going to buy into that kind of stuff because they don't really care if their employees love their lives." And I said, well, then I don't want to work with those companies, because the reality, and now more and more companies are beginning to realize, if I don't care about my people loving their life, they're not going to give their life to this company. They're not going to give their full A game to this company. And so what sounded airy-fairy to some people is absolutely pragmatic to the success of a business. So when you have an organization that has a well-defined purpose and well-defined core values, and they line everything up with that, they're going to be causing good things for everybody involved. Otherwise, they're not necessarily going to be.
Yeah. We just experienced something similar. And I know that I've mentioned this to you, but I just want to be very clear on how things can take shape. And when everyone wins, means that the organization, especially at its top, has to be sending that message. Recently, I think I shared with you, the Boeing union went on strike and they've since gone back to work. But their new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, intervened. And when he came out of the gate, what he was doing, he was basically threatening the union. One of the headlines here was something like, "You better sign the agreement or else." And, you're thinking about that. Now, clearly they did sign it, but I don't know that that threat helped. But clearly you have a new CEO of a company that builds the planes that we fly on, that have recently lost parts in the air or somehow, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's a bolt or a door. And these people that are the nuts and bolts of the organization are treated like they don't deserve to ask, right? And this is the conversation that I want to have with you, because that kind of comment, especially to the headlines of our paper, well, what else, right? Or else, that doesn't really help with the win-win culture. And even if that was a moment of, what do we want to call it? An emotional flare-up? Let's just call it that. Even if that was in a moment of emotion, that tells you a little bit about a CEO. That's not really what brings people to the table long term. Those
Yeah.
kinds of things used to be done, Judy. I want to get your take on them. Are we still acting like that?
I think there are a lot of organizations that are still conditioned to use control models. One of them is the autocratic do it or else, command and control. So that is still very much in motion in many organizations. Another control model that's sort of shocking to people are dangling carrots. Okay, I'm not going to threaten you. I'm going to offer you this incentive or bonus or steak dinner or whatever to get you to jump through my hoop. Or maybe they're doing punishment and reward in a verbal way through praise or criticism, or even by enabling certain people because, just to kind of keep them on the payroll. So all of those things are extrinsic motivators, and many people have been conditioned to use those. So that's one part of it, is how do we move out of a control-oriented way of running an organization, because many people still believe that's the way to go. But the other part of it is, and I don't know if it was Boeing, but I read, I think it was just yesterday, that the reason some of these planes are having all these problems is they have farmed out the engineering to $9 per hour people to come in from other countries. And that's another example of selling out on your employees, because your bottom line becomes more important than people or purpose or principles. And
Yeah.
so even an organization trying to grow real fast that will put those at risk, they are going to lose in the long run, because they're hurting people by making profit more important than people, purpose, and principles.
Yeah.
So hope that kind of answers some of
Well,
that.
no, it does. And when we come back, we're going to talk about how do we flip the switch on this? It's
Mhm.
more like a dimmer switch. What is a healthy culture? And how do we take an organization and give them a model, give them something that could transform them? Um, what's interesting about that comment, and I don't know if it was Boeing or not, but what the practice you just mentioned happens all the time. Now, I will say this before we go to break real quick. I don't know what state in the United States you live in. There are some states that allow you to have a certain long and wide range of contract people in your workforce that you pay well. Washington State, not at the top of that list. And so, how can we engage in a culture that goes beyond just the person, the group, the team, the organization? But what is the culture that allows us to thrive as business owners, entrepreneurs, and have the highest level of quality possible? That's what Judy Ryan is going to take on. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back, and you will be introduced to a brand new, but yet proven approach to culture. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. You are listening to, I know I'm Dr. Pat. I take this first journey with the most incredible Judy Ryan, CEO. And this is what I said to you before, CEO of LifeWork Systems, but you're going to hear much more about the work that she's doing. Today's show is When Everyone Wins. This is the idea of shifting power over and power under to power within and power between. And you've heard a couple of great examples, but now you're going to hear from Judy about the most incredible way to take a look at what you're dealing with in organizations. We call it culture. But before we do, again, how do people find out about you? Do you have any upcoming events? Tell us what's going on. And then we'll get into culture. EX.
Well, I hope all the listeners, our listeners, will look us up on my website, lifeworksystems.com. We do have clinics every month on the network, the Transformation Network. One of my episodes every month will be a live clinic that we hope some of you will come and join. And right now, we have a certification program in play. If anybody out there wants to learn about healthy culture and then help lead organizations in adopting our model. So those are some things that I'd be happy to talk with anyone about.
Yeah. We're going to find that this particular area is going to be one of those areas once upon a time we just used to talk about, but now as we move forward, the level of when everyone wins has to be so important in these cultures. It's so diverse. So many different things that really come to the forefront that could get in the way of things, but there's so much potential. So tell us about your approach to a healthy culture.
Yeah, and I want to do it a little bit in a contrast, a compare and contrast. First of all, most of us have been so conditioned, even in the way we were raised as children and the way we were treated in schools, that the highest priority was compliance. And it was expediency in schools and in families. And in workplaces, it's additionally profitability. So those things are not bad in and of themselves, but when those are the highest priorities, so I'll tell you the downside, the negative side of that. When we talked a minute ago about some of these control models, when a person comes from a leadership position with a do it or else, a threat or an autocratic approach, the belief you're holding about somebody is, or a group of people, is you can't be trusted. I have to manage you. I have to kind of be the one to manage your behavior, and you're accountable to what I tell you to do. Now, what that usually nurtures in people is resentful compliance, which I call C- kind of output. When we're resentful, we're not going to really put our full effort in because we're doing it almost under protest, or we're going to rebel and resist. And there's a lot of statistics out there about how many people are in both of those categories. And it's a total of about 70% of the population that are reacting to these control models with some level of disengagement. When we reward and incentivize people, we think that, and by the way, rewards and punishments do work. You said, well, if they work, they often do work, but there's a huge cost to them. And that's what most people can't see. So when you reward people, what you believe about them is people are going to be basically selfish and lazy unless I dangle a carrot in front of them. So that's a belief you're holding about people. And when you do that to them, where they're accountable to jump through your hoops, what it nurtures in people are people who are competitive for the reward, who bypass quality work because they want to get to the reward. It starts to set up that, what are you going to give me if I do this? But more importantly, it's been proven that when you incentivize people and try to motivate them from the outside in, which is what you believe in that particular control model, you are actually removing from a person their own intrinsic motivation. You're diminishing it. And that's something most people aren't even aware of, much less would be concerned about. Same when you're doing the praising or criticizing. Your belief about people is I'm somehow superior and my judgment of you matters more than your judgment of me or your judgment of yourself. And what that generates in people are people pleasers and brown nosers and people that won't tell you the truth and won't innovate because they're all about pleasing you. Or on the other side of it, there will be people that will feel the offensiveness of it and kind of have the thought in their head, who died and made you God? And they're going to go into that resentment again. And the same when you're pampering and spoiling and enabling people, you don't have faith in them. You don't believe that they are competent. And you start to get what you believe in about them. You generate people that become entitled, but less responsible and less high performing. So that's the negative side of the control models that are very common in organizations. They're so common that people think it's just the way life works.
Yeah.
So in our model, it's completely different than that. A responsibility-based model is one where your first assumption is that people are great. That people are great. If they're not acting great, it's because there are some of these 4 core needs that they're not getting met, and they want to be great. So that's a totally different mindset. When you have that mindset, your responsibility as a leader is to make sure that everyone is developed fully to take what's called task ownership, personal responsibility for themselves. So it's not being accountable to me. It's not me managing you, motivating you, and evaluating you and enabling you. It's me giving you what you need to be personally responsible and accountable yourself. And that's a much more complex but rewarding and no negative side effects. So in an organization, what that means is that the leaders have to make certain that everyone in the organization is given the conditions, the concepts, the terms, the tools, and the processes, but also the support structures to be able to own things like managing their relationships, managing their productivity, managing their engagement, and managing their progress.
Yeah.
And what happens is instead of fostering a bunch of people that are resentfully compliant or rebellious, you end up really developing people who are self-motivated, self-governing, self-directed, fully engaged. Now, there are always some people that are going to be that way anyway. Maybe they had a good upbringing and they just are very internally motivated, but that's generally only about 29% of any work group. So if you can raise those numbers so that so many more people are in that fully engaged group, that's what is important to do.
Yeah.
And,
Judy, over and over again, I want to ask you this, because this, I think, is where you come in. Over and over again, I know I've seen it, I know you've seen it, where heads of organizations kind of, yes, I know what's wrong here. That I know what's wrong here. And then people like you and me, we go out and we do an assessment, a very unbiased assessment, as unbiased as we can be. And the information comes back very different, right? It comes back insightful. It comes back with nuggets, little gold nuggets that could change the landscape of a culture. This morning I get an article across my desk and I cringed a little bit, but I didn't understand why I was cringing. And it was an article from a keynote speaker who focuses on toxic employees. And I thought to myself, this is becoming such a thing. I often wonder, how does a company let it go that far? See, that's my question, right? How do you deal with a toxic employee? That's the article. And I'm thinking, how did you get there? I mean, how did you get to the place with this employee that you are now put them in a cage as something serious, like the new werewolf movie?
Yeah,
How did we get there?
we call them putting them in the monster box. So Pat, what I would say about that is, in every organization that is run conventionally the way I described with the control models, there's breakdowns, and then there's a lot of blame. So people start saying, why is this happening and who's to blame? And it's finger pointing. It happens in schools. Parents blame teachers, teachers blame parents. They both blame the kids blame the adults. So part of that is really saying, instead of who's to blame, it's what system, if it were put in place, would fix this problem. So one of the things that I want to say about that is, there's a really good book that I read recently that I would highly recommend anybody listening to this. It's called Crossing the Desert. I'm hoping to get Payam Zamani on here. He's the author. He came in from another country. He was persecuted in his country. He had all this opportunity in America. He had to learn the language, was educated because he could be here. By the time he was 28, he and his brother had created a company that went public, and they had over $1 million IPO. But what he discovered in the whole process is that our capitalism and our organizations are set up to reward the stakeholders that are the investors. And that becomes so prominent that employees and even the ideas of a founder are kind of thrown out the window to make sure that you do the expedient thing for the stakeholders. So what he was able to do, fortunately for him, he had enough money to do it. He decided to create a new organization that had all the advantage and innovation of his older organizations, but he could operate from his principles, from his purposes, and he would not use the investors where he felt he had to sell his soul for the stakeholder.
Exactly.
And so he hires minorities, he hires men and women both, and older women, for example, and he brings in values like no gossip within their culture, things like that. That is possible when somebody reorganizes how they're going to do their organization, so that it is not first and foremost for money only. And believe it or not, most of us are raised to be so money greedy in a way,
Yeah.
and not really care about what we're causing one another.
That you just nailed it. It's so funny. I was interviewing Bob Parsons, the founder of GoDaddy, and I was talking to him during the break about our next phase of work and the dance you do with investors. And he said a few things to me that absolutely changed the direction I was going. And they're exactly what you just said. And that is, when you're thinking about your company and how to reshape it, you have to really weigh everything. If you're in dire straits and you're trying to fill a gap and you have no other options, that's when you start to divide your company up and give pieces away. And it was in that conversation with him that he was on the verge of an investor, let's call it investor takeover. And at the last minute, they're all sitting around and he doesn't sign it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was so important to me to hear that, because what do you believe in? What is your value system? Do you know it? When was the last time that each of us, you don't have to be a CEO to be listening to Judy today or to me, but when was the last time you did an inventory? Let's talk about that for a minute, because the main thing that we're talking about here are gaps. And I want to talk about gaps. The main gaps that we're talking about fulfilling have a systemic purpose. what do you find they are? And why is it important to make sure we look at the gap, even if we cannot fill them all at one time?
Now, here's what I would say the biggest gap is, and it's another thing that Adler brought forward, is the term social interest. Social interest is when we are consciously paying attention to what we're doing with our power. What are we causing one another with our power? And a story that I always think of with this is, I remember watching a little boy, he was probably 4 or 5 years old, say to his mom at a grocery store, "Why can't we park here in this spot? It's right by the door." And it was a handicap spot. And I wanted to see what she was going to say. And she walked him over to the sign and she said, "See where it says $500, that $500 there? That's what's going to happen if we park here, we might get in trouble and a cop could take our car and we'd have to pay $500 to get it out of the towing place." And I was so discouraged by that, because social interest would have had her say, "Oh, look at this sign. It's got a little picture of somebody in a wheelchair." Our society is so caring about one another that we save places for people that can't walk as well as you and I can. Isn't that great that we've got each other's back? Now, that's social interest. And when there was an experiment where people were recorded, many people would pull into the handicap spots. And when they put a picture of a handicapped person that said, "Thank you for saving this space for me," they would pull in and pull back out and park elsewhere. But it was as if they had to have it pushed in their face for them to realize that they're causing consequences to somebody. And as soon as they took those signs down, people were parking in those spaces illegally again. So a huge gap that is often overlooked is, how do we nurture and embed within organizations the concept of social interest? Where that was used in prison systems, the recidivism rate, which is repeat reincarceration, went down from the 60 to 70% range down to 4%. And that's 60 to 70% is the disengagement rate we have in companies. So if this can happen in prisons, to take people out of the monster box, to help them be accountable, to help them learn how to have their core needs met without having to violate something, and to have that social interest so they reclaim their power and use it differently, it's a game changer everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a game changer. And I want to ask you this question. It also requires an extraordinary definition of leadership in this arena now. Once upon a time, command and control. Remember that? Command and
Yes,
control leadership.
still alive and well.
Oh, right. And by the way, it's not all gone. And for those of you out there, we pass down to others the only thing we know. And you hear this all more often than not. I didn't know another way. This is the way my boss was. This is what I did. But this is to help people today in this show. Let's talk about the show, because you mentioned the clinic. I would love for you to tell people this show you're doing is going to help in a number of arenas. I would love for you to talk about that, because I know you're super excited about it. And especially, people should know that you are the CEO of a company and your services are available to help them. And that's why part of this show is important. But what do you see the show helping people learn?
Well, I hope it helps them learn a lot of things. The beauty of a clinic is it allows people to see a new concept or a tool and then see how powerful it is when it's implemented. Because there's nothing like seeing an actual success to want more success. So a lot of times, for example, we have a tool called redirecting negative behavior. It's one of our biggest tools. It's an alternative to using punishment and harshness and permissiveness. Well, most people don't even know there's something different than punishment, harshness, or permissiveness. So having an awareness of something new and then seeing it demonstrated is very powerful, so that people can let go of the old and pick up the new. You also mentioned, when you first started asking this, what do you think of leadership? What kind of leadership? Well, first of all, leadership development has traditionally been thought of as developing the people with titles. So they get leadership development. In our model, everyone is developed in their leadership. And what it also requires is that the executives, the senior leaders, the mid-level managers, the supervisors, all of those folks have to mix with the frontline staff when they're learning the culture model. And believe me, for many leaders, this is very uncomfortable, because here we're introducing a shared power model and they're new at it. They know how to do command and control. They know how to do incentives and rewards. They know how to do praise and criticism and enabling. What they don't know how to do is share power with their employees and be vulnerable with them as they're learning beside them. So that's one of the biggest requirements when we take people through a culture transformation, and they have to have a pilot project. That pilot project is required to have people at all the different levels involved in the project. So when they go through and they learn the lessons, and then they lead each other in small groups, those small groups are just like I described in my family, where one week I was leading the family meeting, the next week the 5-year-old was leading the family meeting. You know, and that has to happen within organizations, because what it does is it breaks down all of those barriers of fear so that people can manage relationships with anyone, even your authority figures, and vice versa. When we put them into mentoring pairs, because everyone is mentored in a responsibility-based culture, and they're not even mentored only for a short period of time, like a year, they're mentored ongoing. And sometimes that mentoring pair might be the CEO with the frontline receptionist, and that receptionist is mentoring the CEO back. Because in our model, it's not counseling and coaching or dependent upon somebody's skill level. It's really about knowing how to ask certain kinds of questions that help the other person become aware of what they need to manage, and then to actually move into managing it.
Yeah.
And so it creates a vulnerability in that way. Go ahead.
You know, what you're talking about is so significant and important, Judy. I know we're not going to get to it during this show, but I'm going to tell you the light bulb that went on for me right here. Here's the light bulb. Almost every blockbuster movie you can get your hands on shows or demonstrates the worst of situations because things are breaking down between people. And here we are now in the world of AI, and we have never needed what you're talking about more than we need now. Those systems need to be developed and put in place now for leadership, because when you introduce something as high tech and as integrative and as involved and as AI for everything now, when you're introducing something like that into the world, inevitably, some projects will be misunderstood. Some of them will have no impact, and others will. How do we know it? We just watch what went on in New Jersey and the pollution of water. You know, out of nowhere, drones, water is polluted, cyanide in drinking water, shutting down all the water in New Jersey. And sometimes it's not vindictive. Sometimes it's not terrorism. Do you know what I'm saying? But terrorism is easy to blame. Sometimes, guess what? Human error, right? This model has to address that future, doesn't it?
Well, part of the reason those kind of things happen isn't always vindictiveness, but it's often such a lack of awareness that is the problem. One of the concerns I have about AI, because I think there's a lot of great things about AI, but it's like anything else. If it erases people and if it erases humanity, we are going to lose. All of us are going to lose in the long run. And I'm not even talking about erasing jobs, which is a big deal. I'm talking about erasing people's ability to think for themselves, to speak for themselves, to bring forth new innovations, to be part of a team where they can make a difference. All of those things can easily be erased if we do not make people important. And one of the things that I wanted to just mention about consciousness, if we're not conscious, like the most extreme example is a criminal. A criminal, like let's say a person is in a gang and they have to go murder somebody to be initiated in that gang. But it was the first place they ever felt that they had a chance to feel empowered, lovable, connected, and contributing. They're going to override their conscience and their fear of imprisonment because they want that sense of belonging and significance so deeply. So a criminal, so one of the people I want to have on my show, I don't know if he'll come on, I've written to him, is the sheriff that did the social experiment called Unlocked. Because what happened was they were using control methods out the wazoo. Those inmates were in their cells 23 hours out of 24. If you want to use any version of command and control, it's certainly in a prison, right? Especially a high security prison. So what he did was he decided this isn't working. We keep sending them back out and they keep coming back in again and doing really heinous things. So what he had them do was he had them have to learn. He forced them into a situation where they had to learn social interest, because if one of them wasn't considering what they were causing the others, they were all going to lose. Now, it wasn't the most ideal conditions because they still had the threat of being thrown back in their prison cells. But what he was trying to do was give them an opportunity to start operating as people that can make a difference together. And they started to rise to that. Now, hopefully companies don't have to get to the point where it's so high and dire, but many companies are suffering in a very dire way. They just don't realize it.
Yeah.
Even when companies do sort of have this glimpse into a different way of doing culture, they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to do it in a way that it's really going to work. They might bring in a workshop on it or something and then say, well, we tried it, it didn't work. So part of the problem is not knowing what you want to shift into. And then even when you do, knowing how to shift into it. So I just think there's so much to be said about these problems that are occurring, like the water that you just mentioned. It's usually a symptom of a much bigger problem of systems that aren't considering other people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
well, and then this is what we're talking about. For those of you out there, you hear Judy and I keep saying systems. We both come from system approach philosophies. Judy, thank you so much. This was a great first show. Again, let people know how they can find you. And what do you want to leave us with? What's your personal message?
okay. Well, I would first say, please come and check us out on our website, LifeWorkSystems.com. I hope you'll also reach out to us at info@lifeworksystems.com, because we'd love to be able to send you some things if you want specific information. And then you said, what do I want to leave people with? I want to leave them with knowing you deserve a life you love, knowing you deserve to be seen and heard and to win. Even at the same time, you can do that while helping other people win beside you. It's the only fulfilling way to live. So be willing to put down your conditioning of win-lose and open to what would it be like if I learned some things to create win-win.
I love it. Judy Ryan, everybody. Remember, when everyone wins. Thank you so much. We're going to be back. This is an entire series. You're going to hear about the clinic. You're going to be part of it, and so much more from Judy Ryan. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to When Everyone Wins, where we're shifting power over and under to power within and between. I'm Judy Ryan, your transformation talk radio host. Tune in each second and fourth Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific time to learn new concepts and tools and listen to conversations I have with thought leaders and change agents. You'll also see real-world applications of what I'm covering so that you experience the power of the concepts and tools I share. In each episode, I bring you my knowledge from decades in workplace culture transformation and leadership development as the founder